Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Jane McAlevey and Abby Lawlor. Jane McAlevey is a veteran labor organizer who is currently a senior policy fellow at UC Berkeley's Labor Center. Abby Lawlor is also an organizer and a labor lawyer who's a legal fellow at the Public Rights Project. Together, they are the authors of the new book, Rules to Win by Power and Participation in Union Negotiations. Thank you so much, Jane McAlevey, Abby Lawlor, for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Great to be here.
Thanks so much for having us.
I want to start by just reading you something that Vox published a few days ago. A very pessimistic take on the American labor movement. Said, every once in a while, reporters see a few successful unionization drives in the United States, like at Starbucks or Amazon, and conclude the U.S. is in the midst of a labor union resurgence, that unions are booming or they're suddenly and rapidly rebounding. But we have to be honest about the situation. Organized labor is not booming, rebounding, or in a resurgence of any kind. Instead, it's in decline, as it has been for many years. Your new book focuses on the tactical, but before we get to the nitty-gritty, I want to dwell a little bit on the big picture of where we are, the context for all of this. Do you think that what I have just read you is an accurate assessment of the lay of the land?
I think no. I think the first part of what the person said is somewhat accurate. There are these moments when people think, okay, now it's coming back again. And what we bump up against are the extraordinary power of the union busters in the United States in particular. And what's interesting and different this time around, speaking to that piece that you just read, is that one thing encouraging right now is that there's explicit discussion about the rule of union busting in this country and the need to frankly try and rein these folks in and contain them and curtail them. And certainly I think, Abby, and I think the book contributes to a dialogue in terms of one way to do that, but many ways to do it in terms of how to handle the negotiations and overcome them, in particular in the first contract context, right, which is where the union busters are still very much alive. But so I would say the excitement is real. The mobilization of forces on the ground right now is actually quite substantial. The young people who are bringing energy into today's kind of revival moment, buoyed by, the second or record high support for trade unions in the general public, has led to a more growing awareness, frankly, that there's a real problem with union busting in the United States. And people going into these fights understand that it's not going to be an easy fight. So I would say what's more encouraging right now in a post to Bernie Sanders running for president campaigns, in a kind of post-pandemic moment that we're in, is there's really broad anger. The kind of usual tropes that union busters use to dissuade people from forming unions don't hold up in the way that they did, in part because of the incredible abuses that workers just suffered under the pandemic. That would be my first quick reaction. Abby, I'd feel free to jump in.
Yeah, Abby, how do you feel when you hear someone say organized labor continues to be in decline?
Yeah, I think just numerically, that's a reality we have to sit with. And also, I am predisposed to look for the sources of hope. I think what Jane described in terms of both people's knowledge and understanding and willingness to take on the really hard fights that it takes to organize, the growth there, I think, has been really exciting. And in terms of just thinking about how to scale up a movement that could grow at the speed that, the labor movement has in moments historically, I'm really excited to see just all of the work that's going into creating training spaces and reading groups and materials. And our book, I want to count among those materials of just, vastly expanding the number of people who have the skills and knowledge to do the organizing that needs to happen for us to stop the decline and to start to grow the movement moving forward. So that's my maybe more hopeful take on where I hope things are headed.
With that, it's not just to confront you with, well, the labor movement's still in decline, isn't it? But to say that I do think I share the impression that we are building the foundation of something, but the very, very hard work of actually growing union density in the United States remains ahead of us. Now, what's interesting is, and I think, Jane, the last time you were on our Current Affairs program, you discussed some of the broad questions of how to build the labor movement in the United States. But this book that you have both just put out is, I don't want to say narrow, but it is focused on what individual unions do to exact concessions. And perhaps we could start with where your book kind of fits in the task that lies ahead of us.
Yeah. First of all, I think the use of the word narrow is interesting for me because it seems like we're trying to draw a very broad message, which is about participation broadly and how that undergirds democracy, which is an analogy that we make sort of in the opening, but also in particular in the concluding chapter. So one is it's a sort of larger argument that the more people understand how power works, the more capable they are of actually overcoming the kind of obstacles that are thrown in their face along the way. So where it fits in part is one, trying to open up a topic that has not ever actually been covered in the literature, which is sort of the mechanics of negotiations, but it's really about the principles of democracy in a trade union and what it means to involve and invite and engage workers into the most important decision that most workers engage in a union for, which is what's going to be in their union contract. And to the degree that we are pushing hard in the book on examples of when you open up the negotiations process and when workers come to understand who their employer really is, whether it's in a first contract fight, like we're dealing with in a number of cases right now from REI to Trader Joe's to fill in the blank, we're arguing that, in fact, the more you open up the process for people to understand it, the more capable they are of actually overcoming both the union busters and, in a larger argument, defeating the kind of disinformation, misinformation, polarization that's happening in our democracy writ large.
Mm-hmm. I'll say that if folks within unions, you often, first, very few workers are in a union to begin with, and folks who are in unions often only see the way that their particular union practices negotiations and have no sense necessarily of ways in which it could be different from how their union has always done it. So I think this book serves a particular role in providing real examples for people of how other unions have approached negotiations, and then also some kind of core principles that people can bring in thinking about how to do negotiations differently and better.
Yeah, I just one more comment on it. I think, we say in the beginning, and it's sort of an extension. When I sat down and began to work on it and then had the extreme pleasure, fortune, luck, and many other things to then drag Abby into this process, who made it so much easier and better. But when I began to work on this, I was thinking of it as a direct extension of no shortcuts. Mm-hmm. In other words, what we're introducing is an organizer's approach to negotiations, right? If No Shortcuts was focused on laying out a set of principles that delineated how do you build power in an organizing campaign, this is essentially an extension of an argument that says, when you involve mass participation, really fundamentally in every decision that you're making, including the most important one for most workers, that's an organizing approach to negotiations versus a advocacy or kind of a mobilizing approach to negotiations. So it's an extension of an argument about mass participation at the most fundamental level, and that's what it's going to take to actually overcome the decline that we've been experiencing for so long.
Yeah, I want to get into that in more detail, because I think what's interesting about this book as kind of the sequel is that certainly in the press, there is some coverage, obviously not enough labor coverage, but when there is coverage of the labor movement, often about the fight to win union recognition in the first place. What happens afterwards, the contract negotiations, the somewhat unsexy part, perhaps gets somewhat less attention. Certainly, I see less coverage of, for example, the Amazon labor union post-winning recognition than the fight to win recognition. But it's so important, right? You want to get it, just getting a union recognized, that's half the battle. And then you actually have to get your contract. So I think what's cool about this is that you draw our attention to the actual really important part of what are you going to get for your members as a union.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to Jane's point about kind of building on no shortcuts and the organizing principles there, it's how to carry through all of the good work that people did to win their union. How can they then carry that forward into the negotiations process? itself. And, that's often a moment where there's sort of a shift in terms of the staffing of those campaigns on the union side, from organizing to, having more of a representative at the table. And so for workers to be able to carry through their participation and their organization from recognition into the first contract fight, I think is really key to kind of maintaining that participation over time. And to combat, I think something we really wanted to highlight in the book was that union busting doesn't stop when workers win recognition. It ramps up, if anything, as, the boss gets another bite at the apple and busting the union to prevent that first contract from ever being settled. And so to be prepared for that and to really take that on through good organizing is just so important if workers are going to actually be able to get a first contract at the end of the day.
Jane, can I ask you if this is a fair characterization? You are kind of associated with, shall we say, the argument that mass participation and democracy within unions are not just a luxury, but are pragmatic and essential and strategically necessary. But there can be a sort of the way of thinking that suggests that that's all great for winning the election, but once the election is won, then you designate the negotiators and they go off and try and negotiate the contract. But in this book, it seems like one of the core arguments is no, that principle of mass participation being strategically important applies through the entire process.
Yeah. Not only through the entire process, by the way, through the life of the worker and their union, just to be clear, right? But I think part of what we're trying to argue is that, and it's certainly my life experience, when you're in the crush of a National Labor Relations Board election, workers are working incredibly hard just to overcome the union busters in most cases. And so solidarity and trust are being built. And probably at the heart of winning a union drive is trust building and what we call identifying those key worker leaders who actually have enough trust of their coworkers to help lead them to victory. What happens in the first contract phase is what we call the development of governing power and centering worker leaders themselves as learning how to take control of their workplace. So if the election campaign is a lot about, whoa, this is a lot harder than we thought. Our boss hires as professionals. They're really tough. We got to overcome this. It is holy hell warfare. What begins to happen once you do get, assuming you get past recognition, you get to the first contract phase, it's there in my life experience where you begin to take more time to have the workers themselves, who are often really smart about changes that would make their workplace actually better, not just for the workers in them, but for people who are either on the receiving end of the services, patients in the context of healthcare, students and parents in the context of education, et cetera. It's that workers get to bring their innate intelligence about how the workplace should be run and then learn how to negotiate, literally negotiate, contend with, and to overcome a sort of top-down dictatorship of the minority approach by management, which is what exists in most workplaces outside of workers forming a union. So there's so little experience in the United States of workers in the working class getting the experience of what it means to govern, to actually run something, that's part of why I think we thought the book was urgent. So the first contract and then the successor agreements are literally workers sitting down and saying, how do we want the workplace to work? Now that we've overcome the campaign, right? The campaign is a very different focus. And when you get to the phase of getting to sit down with the employer, if you're involving the whole of the workforce, which is what the book argues for, then the discussion about workers beginning to dream and bring their serious expertise from 10 years on the job, 20 years on the job. I'll give you an example from a conversation we were having last night with some worker leaders about a contract campaign they had just won, where one of the workers pointed out, this is in Louisville, Kentucky, where one of the workers who had gone through a very difficult successor contract negotiation, and they beat back some really racist, really awful proposals by management. The worker leader said, when management looked at us and looked at me as their new chief negotiator, this is a worker named Lillian Brent in Louisville, Kentucky, she said, management thought they were just looking at, a 15-year bus driver, when actually I had more experience and all of the workers had more experience than any of the managers in the day-to-day running of a public transit system. So it's the contract phase where you say, we're going to rewrite the rules of how this place works, not just for wages and working conditions, but for that old expression of controlling the production decisions. Like we can make a better workplace than management most of the time. And then they're also building the power and the understanding that to be able to enforce the future contract that they win, they actually have to learn how to hold management accountable to the contract they're going to win. And that's going to take a lot of power. It's not going to work through the grievance process. It's not going to work by filing objections 5 years later. It's about, can workers learn what it takes to manage their workplace, to control the workplace? Again, not just their wages and not just their benefits, but really how do we create a better quality of life, and how do we create, a better quality of life? So it's on the output, it's on controlling production, it's on all of it. And we could go through a lot of examples of that. But it's really the first contract phase in particular is where workers learn to take their brilliance and their expertise and begin to challenge management in the governance of the whole of their workplace.
Abby, could you help me understand a little more what the contrast between the approach that you lay out in this book and what an alternate approach that you would see as less effective would be? I mean, if you're laying out the argument for mass participation and inclusion, how does that differ from the way that things are either traditionally done or could be done that you're saying not to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call the approach that we argue for in the book high participation, high power negotiations. And that has kind of three core elements baked into it. It's negotiations that are big, negotiations that are open, and negotiations that are transparent. And I can kind of unpack each of those and do a little bit of contrasting with, unfortunately, the worst of what we see in union negotiations. So I'll start actually with transparency, right? We unfortunately see in a lot of union negotiations, the workers and management will walk in for the first day of negotiations, and the first thing on the table is a set of ground rules that contains a gag order that would prevent any of the folks on the union's bargaining committee from sharing with their coworkers, with people in the bargaining unit, what is happening in those negotiations. So sort of the point number one on transparency is there can be no gag orders, no ground rules that would prevent workers from learning about what's actually going on in the negotiations process. And similarly, really push for, fast, clear, widespread communication about everything that's happening in the negotiation session, so people are totally up to speed and knowledgeable about what's going on. In terms of the element of big, we're advocating for the bargaining team that's actually sitting at the table with management, making decisions on proposals, to be large and representative of all of the different types of workers who are in a bargaining unit. So that's all of the different departments. If it's shift-based work and people are on the day shift and the night shift, having workers represent those different shifts that people are on, as contrasted with a bargaining team that is maybe 3, 4, 5 people, maybe people who are on the executive committee of the union or position holders. Maybe they all come from the same department or area of the workplace where there's kind of traditionally been a lot of union activity, but it's not a group of people that's representative or reaching all of the different corners of the bargaining unit. And then lastly, on open rate sessions, we advocate for sessions that are open for anyone who's covered by the collective bargaining agreement to be able to come and attend. That's a very different approach than, the more traditional approach of you have the bargaining team in the room and that's it. And no other workers are there to be able to be there and observe what's happening.
Now, I guess what I want to ask is these sound like they would be justifiable on their own as matters of principle, right? Workers deserve to have a seat at the table. They deserve transparency in negotiations. And if anyone claims to speak on their behalf, they should know what is being said on their behalf. But in the book, you argue that this is also good practice for getting the results that you want. Explain to us why you argue that these principles are not just matters of principles, but are also pragmatic.
Sure. And I think sitting on them being a matter of principle is, for 1 second, is important, right? Unions are fundamentally democratic organizations. Having this democratic practice within them and within their internal function, I think is important in itself. But also, as we seek to illustrate through examples of a bunch of really amazing campaigns, you also just win more when you're you're adopting these principles. And to go back to gag rules, right? There's, in my mind, no effective way to mobilize people to fight back against a really nasty management proposal. In the Louisville example Jane just gave, right, of there being a proposal on the table that would give vastly different raises to white workers versus Black workers. If the people on that bargaining team weren't able to actually share that proposal with the broader workforce and tell them about what was happening in that room, there'd be no way for them to organize and to fight back against that by using their collective power at work. So I think, that's just one example of it being so fundamental for people to actually know what's going on in the negotiations room, to actually really understand it and to understand the fight that they're up against in their negotiations, for them to be bought into the kind of organizing that it's going to take to fight back and to win the kind of contract that they want.
I think just to add on to that, part of what we're trying to say is transparency is fundamental. Like that's a fundamental principle, right? And gag orders, which really are signed by the majority of unions, most negotiations are covered by a kind of gag order, which is extraordinary. So going back to how do we overcome the decline? How do we rebuild the movement? Let's start by, part of this argument is about let's start by changing the things that we're in control of, right? So let's bring workers into the process as fundamental partners. But transparency alone is insufficient. So it's transparency plus structured mass participation on the part of the working class so that they can then go on to win. But it's really hard to involve either hundreds, depending on the size of the workplace, or thousands or tens of thousands, if you can't even trust the workforce enough to understand the dynamics that are going on in their own negotiations. It's a pretty direct signal to the workers that their voice is not as meaningful as it needs to be in the life of their own organization. So by flipping that script, it's just a point to make that while we could have written a book that just said you just need to be transparent, but that's not sufficient actually to win. So to your point about tactics and strategy, the principles of democracy, small d democracy, are central in the work we do. But yes, for it to be strategic, it has to be the three components that we lay out that Abby articulated, which is transparency is fundamental, in addition to that big and representative, and then open to all the workers. That's the way to build towards something like a 95% or 100% out strike. And that's the part of the extension of the argument from No Shortcuts, is that we get that kind of participation when we take a different kind of approach to the work. And that's what leads us to mass victories and contracts that are shockingly good today versus most of what is passing for a sorry state of working in America.
Well, some of our listeners may hear what you're saying, the principles that you've laid out here, and think, well, yeah, that sounds reasonable, or even that sounds obvious. But what you indicated just there was that the methods that you're advocating are not currently the predominant methods used by American labor unions in existing negotiations.
Absolutely. Sadly, let's just pause for a moment on the moment of encouragement, though. Since we sat down to do the book, we've had two different reform movements win, one at the Teamsters and one at the United Auto Workers, right? Where what exactly is happening is not exactly clear yet, but we know already there's a lot more willingness to be transparent, and we don't yet know the shape of how the negotiations themselves will work. But with those two exceptions at the national level, and then the Amalgamated Transit Workers Union, who just in October of 2022, so less than a year ago, the Amalgamated Transit Workers Union actually moved, I think, a first of its kind resolution to move all of their local unions to transparent, big and open negotiations. So that's at or international level, as American unions like to say, US and Canadian unions principally. So there are encouraging signs about where this is going right now. But honestly, the vast majority of unions sign ground rules that greatly constrain their own capacity to engage their own workers, which is extraordinary, really.
Yeah. So again, lots of unions do contract surveys, but is really not something that they're tracking, that they have any particular goal around, that they're using in any way to build organization or structure. So we're trying to take this thing that unions already do, but show how it can serve just that basic function of actually gathering broad input on what should be in the contract, which a lot of negotiation surveys, because of just really low participation, don't even serve that function, but are also a key step in really building the kind of organization that you're going to need to build to a strike threat or an actual strike to win what you have in the table in negotiations. Another one I'll just throw out really quickly, and we plug the appendix of the book because we really wanted to put these tools directly in people's hands so that they could use in negotiations, is the 3 rules of the room. And we have a little handout that people can use that actually has those, but just as a tool for people to kind of get on the same page and have a shared set of expectations about how people are going to behave when they're attending negotiation sessions. So that's, making sure that there's a way for anyone to pass notes to the lead negotiator if they have a thing that comes up during the session that they want to flag, or they want to call a caucus so that you can kick management out of the room for a couple of minutes and have a conversation just among workers and just on the union side. Another important rule is just to have one designated spokesperson at the table who's able to pick up those notes, but that there's kind of clear communication in terms of who's talking. And then I always forget what the third rule is when we go through them.
Is this the poker face?
Yeah, poker face.
Poker face
thank
at
you.
all times. It's in caps.
And yes, showing no reaction, positive or negative, to the proposals that are coming across the table from the other side, so that you don't kind of give them that tip off on how you're feeling.
Right. So in the book, you say that a lot of people don't realize when they go into this necessarily how absurd and vicious the union busters' misinformation attempts, intimidation, rule breaking, sore losing, and procedural warfare can be. If you're speaking to a group of young labor organizers who are thrilled that they're about to win their union election, they're about to win recognition, and you're going to warn them about what they're about to face in this contract process, what do you mean by these absurd and vicious tactics that are going to be employed? What can be expected?
Oh, sky's the limit here. I mean, if you start with what we're looking at right now, whether it's at Starbucks or Amazon or some other recent examples distinct from the book, you will see that just getting to the negotiations table is half the fight. Like literally, right? I mean, at Amazon, at JFK 8, where the workers really clearly won the election, there has not yet been what we call legal recognition of the union. They're not even close to getting to the negotiations table. And, Howard Schultz, union buster supreme at the moment, is taking a different tactic about stalling. Even though some of those shops have gotten recognition, they're taking a set of completely different tactics. Stall, delay, refuse to show up, refuse to come in the room, refuse to get information. There's such a long list of tools that the union busters have and that they use. And part of what I think that both the principle and the strategy that good organizing engages is to be very transparent and upfront with workers in the context of new organizing work, right? And trying to get that first contract. It's about actually outlining all of that to people. It's about letting them know that they're going to try and delay this for at least 12 months, assuming that the union gets certified, because at the 12-month mark is when the union busters can come back in under labor law, which I often call management law because it's so stacked against workers. But under current labor law, once a union gets recognized, there's a 12-month period by which there's a bar from what's called decertification of the union, which is why, on average, it takes 400-something odd days to actually even get a first contract. It's a direct incentive to the union busters to stall, delay, do nothing, drag their feet. If they do show up and do very little and leave, not give a negotiation date for another long period of time, and try and get to that 12-month mark where, frankly, they are going to inspire a second election to throw the union out. And we're seeing that right now in the earliest elections at Starbucks in Buffalo, New York, which is where the campaign began, where there's an attempt, and the labor board is going to be playing an interesting role here, but where there's an attempt to do just that, where they have delayed for beyond 12 months. And technically, under the law, it's workers, who have to file this petition to then sort of vote the union out because there is no contract, right? That's literally management will refuse to get in the room or delay or refuse to do much of anything for 12 months. And then at 12 months and a day, the first really sophisticated flyer comes out that says, why even have a union? 12 months later, you don't even have a contract, right? So these guys are just brilliant at their union busting tactics. Well, there isn't they're only able to put that flyer out because they're using delay and stall tactics along the way. So central to this is, one, making sure workers understand, right? So that they don't fall prey to that argument, that you explain to them up front, there's going to be 2 rounds to this fight. And in order to get through the round that's going to change the terms of your working conditions and potentially, frankly, if it's a great contract, change your home life too, you're going to have to understand this is a 2-stage fight. That's one of the most important things to do up front. And then secondly, again, it's not just that you can go into the governing period where workers learn to synthesize their intelligence, figure out how to have a better workplace run, but it's also a phase where they can begin to do the kind of work that we outline in the book about really strategically involving the broader community in the campaign and explaining all these things to the broader community as well, themselves, not staff hired by a union, but rank and file workers, drawing the connections to their own community, and then educating their community to bring them into the fight, which both gives workers more confidence to stay the course in the fight itself, but also, as you said in the beginning, is strategic because it's just going to bring more power to the fight. It's going to have them bring in the faith community, bring in the city council, bring in the mayor, bring in the elected leadership, bring in, we could go through all the examples of what a really effective high participation campaign does. But the more participating, the broader the community campaign is going to be too.
Well, just sort of to conclude and bring this back kind of to where we started, it's very easy to tell a pessimistic story. It is very easy to pour cold water on the victories that have occurred and say, well, union density hasn't increased, or, yes, well, you'll win your election, but then, you'll lose in the contract fight as all these tactics will be deployed against you in a rigged system. But one of the messages that comes out of the book, these are rules to win by, is that you are determined to help people win. And I take it, believe it can happen. And in fact, you tell us some stories in the book of how it can and has happened. And so perhaps we could conclude with a little bit of, if not optimism, at least determination that if you follow the rules to win by, you might actually win. Is that fair?
I think both optimism and determination. In a position in my day job, I think a lot about the impact that new technology is having on workers. And, there's sort of just such a glaring absence of any lawmaking, right, that's going to protect workers from surveillance, from new technology coming into the workplace. And then I look at what hotel workers were able to do in Boston, and by organizing and fighting through their contract and going on strike, they won protections from their jobs being taken away by new technology coming into the hotels. And, that was something that they just went out and did because it was a real threat that they were facing in their work. And they made it happen through their sheer organization and guts, and by being out on the street in Boston in November in the rain and the snow. And they now have this protection that workers around the country desperately need, and they went out and made it happen. So that, I think, to me, is just, one example of the tremendous potential of what we get when workers have a real voice in their workplace, and just an incredible example of people making that happen for themselves, and gives me a lot of hope for the future.
In addition to that, there's completely agree with that example of technology and where workers are actually way ahead of the law. I mean, part of what we argue is that contracts and collective bargaining is a form of public policy. It just is. Collective bargaining, the standards that have been achieved in negotiations in this country for all of time, set the sort of floor for what the rest of workers in the country get. So it's really in everybody's interest that workers continue to achieve really great contracts. And the book is filled with examples of how to do that. In the case of Einstein, that's even an example of an incredibly vicious union busting campaign. And frankly, from election to contract, we're talking about a matter of 7 months. This is with legal charges up the wazoo. This is with going to the labor board. This is a union buster who alleged that the union cheated, that the labor board cheated. This is the same argument that the Amazon lawyers are using, right? They actually sued the labor board in the Philadelphia election that I talk about in the book. And despite that, the workers go on to win a tremendous contract in relatively very short amount of time. Why? Because they did an incredible job organizing both their coworkers and the whole of their community to stand with them in the face of what was a $1.1 million union busting operation. So it's absolutely possible. And that is what we are laying out and showing. and will continue to show. And the example that Abby and I have referenced now is just from a story I wrote in The Nation magazine a couple of months ago, because now we're hearing lots of stories of local victories with people using some of these core principles and already showing wins that would not be possible if they were doing traditional closed down negotiations. So I think there's a lot to be encouraged about right now.
Well, to find out more about the models that we can learn from and the principles that the labor movement can follow to triumph, people need to pick up the book Rules to Win By, Power and Participation in Union Negotiations, available from Oxford University Press. Jane McAlevey and Abby Lawlor, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.